The crack appeared on a Tuesday. It ran up the concrete of a wall on one of the lower floors, wide enough that people stopped to look at it, wide enough that someone filmed it, wide enough that an engineer took one look and said the building had to be closed. And it was closed. For a few hours on that Tuesday, everyone got out. The next morning, the shops on the ground floor stayed shut. The bank stayed shut. And roughly 3,000 garment workers were told to go back inside and get to work. 57 minutes into that shift, the building came down. Took 90 seconds. More than 1,100 people died. In a building that everyone with the power to keep it closed had already been told was unsafe. This is the Rana Plaza collapse. And this is the chain that pulled it down. Rana Plaza stood in Savar, an industrial suburb of Dhaka, and it was built to be ordinary. A commercial building, shops and offices, on ground that was never meant to carry what it ended up carrying. Bangladesh at the time was the second largest garment exporter on earth, stitching clothes for Western brands at prices that depended on one thing above all: keeping costs down. The people who worked in that building were mostly young women, many of them the main earners for their families. When they were told the building was safe, refusing to believe it carried a cost most of them could not afford. Hold on to that because it's the pressure the whole chain runs on. Rana Plaza was originally approved as a building a few stories tall, meant for shops and offices, light use, predictable loads. That is not what got built. The owner added floor after floor beyond what was permitted, until the structure stood 8 stories high, and then filled the upper floors not with offices but with garment factories. A floor of offices and a floor of garment production are not the same weight. A garment floor is packed with heavy industrial sewing machines, tightly spaced rows of workers, and stacks of material. The building was being asked to carry loads it was never designed to imagine. The first link was poured into the structure itself, one unapproved floor at a time. Garment factories run on electricity, and in Savar the power failed constantly. So the factories kept large diesel generators to run through the outages, heavy machines weighing tons that vibrated hard when they fired up. And those generators were placed high in the building. On the upper floors, the structure was never built to support in the first place. Every time the power cut and the generators kicked in, the whole building shook. A structure already stressed beyond its design was being shaken daily by the very machines keeping it running. The people inside felt it. They had been feeling it for a long time. The second link. On the 23rd of April, the cracks appeared. Deep ones, running through walls and support columns across several floors. Plaster fell from ceilings. People heard the building making sounds. The shops and the bank on the lower floors evacuated and stayed closed. An engineer who looked at the damage said plainly that the building was not safe to occupy. This was the moment the chain could have stopped for free. The danger had been identified out loud by someone qualified to identify it, and the building had already been emptied once. Every hard part was done. All that was required was to keep it closed. Instead, the garment workers were told to come back the next morning, and told the cracks had been checked and the building was fine. It had not been made fine. Nothing had been repaired overnight. The third link, and the one that turns an unsafe building into a body count. On the morning of the 24th, thousands of workers gathered outside. Many of them did not want to go in. They had seen the cracks. Some refused and stood in the street. This is the part that matters most because it means the danger was not invisible to the people in charge. It was being argued about in the open at the door. The workers who hesitated were told they would lose their pay or their jobs if they didn't go to their stations. For people living close to the edge, that threat did the work. They went in, not because they believed it was safe, but because the alternative was going home with nothing. The fourth link is the lever, fear of the mountain, overruled by fear of losing the wage. Just before 9, the shift started. And then, as it did most mornings, the power failed. The generators on the upper floors roared to life, and the building began to shake, the way it always did. Only this time it was shaking a structure laced with fresh cracks through its load-bearing columns. The vibration was the last push. Witnesses described concrete falling, then the columns going, then the floors coming down onto each other in sequence. 57 minutes into the shift, the whole thing pancaked. The fifth link wasn't a decision made that morning, it was every earlier decision arriving at once, triggered by a generator switch that no one thought twice about. The collapse took about 90 seconds. 8 stories folded down into a slab of concrete, steel, and machinery only a couple of meters high, with more than 3,000 people inside. It became the deadliest garment industry disaster in history, and one of the worst industrial disasters of any kind. The rescue went on for weeks. People were pulled alive from the rubble days later. One woman was found after 17 days. By the time it ended, the toll stood at 1,134 dead and roughly 2,500 injured, many of them maimed for life. There was no pretending this was an act of God. A crack had been photographed. An engineer had said the words. The building had already been emptied once. Every element of the warning existed on the record before anyone died. The building's owner was arrested trying to flee the country and charged, along with dozens of others, including factory owners and local officials, with offenses that a Bangladeshi court ultimately accepted as murder. Investigators called the deaths a mass killing, not an accident. Years later, the case is still winding through the courts. The owner has been convicted and jailed in a separate corruption case, but the murder trial itself remains unresolved, delayed again, and what did change came from outside. The disaster forced Western brands and unions into a binding safety accord covering thousands of factories, and pushed Bangladesh to reform its labor laws. It took 1,100 deaths, filmed and photographed and impossible to deny, to make the safety of these workers a price the industry was finally willing to pay. And again, there's no single monster. There's a chain. Stack factories on a building meant for shops. Put the shaking generators up high. See the crack and reopen anyway. Threaten the people who don't want to go in. And switch the generators on. 5 decisions, each one made to protect a shipment, a wage, a deadline, that together brought 8 stories down on more than 1,100 people who had already been told, in plain words, that the building was not safe. The disaster is almost never the first thing that goes wrong. It's the last link in a chain of decisions, each one reasonable to the person who made it, that quietly removed every defense until nothing stood between an ordinary shift and catastrophe. That's the chain. And there is always a next one.